Welcome to the Economic Rockstar Podcast with your host, Frank Conway, connecting brilliant minds in economics and finance.
In this week's episode of the Economic Rockstar Podcast, I speak with Dr. Stuti Khemani, Senior Economist at the World Bank. We talk about her current policy research report, Making Politics Work for Development, Harnessing Transparency and Citizen Engagement, as well as the Dictator's Dilemma, what makes a successful autocratic government, whether culture plays a significant role in successful government and the economy, and the importance of art and creativity in policy making. You can check out all the links, books and resources mentioned by Dr. Khemani at economicrockstar.com/Stuti Khemani, STUTI Khemani.
Never miss an episode of the Economic Rockstar podcast. Visit economicrockstar.com, submit your name and email, and you will get each episode straight to your inbox.
How far can we go with something like transparency, which is relatively more tractable to them than confronting the political constraints of difficult reforms? It's not really nefarious leaders, but it's prejudices, biases, myopia, and the lack of capacity to understand technical evidence among citizens at large, which can prevent well-intentioned leaders from doing what is supported by the evidence. But I do think that there are individuals who, by their individual idiosyncrasies, sort of gravitate towards sort of big questions and grandiose ideas, if you will, who also tend to be the more artistic types.
Hi, Frank Conway here, and you're listening to the Economic Rockstar podcast. I am so honoured to have Stuti Khemani join me today. Hi, Stuti. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Frank. Thank you for having me.
Stuti Khemani is a senior economist in the Development Research Group of the World Bank. She joined through the Young Professionals program after obtaining a PhD in economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Khemani's area of research is the political economy of public policy choices and institutional reforms for development. Her work is published in leading economics and political science journals such as the American Economic Journal, Journal of Development Economics, and American Political Science Review. Stuti has studied the impact of electoral politics on fiscal policy and intergovernmental fiscal relations, drawn policy implications for the design of institutions to promote fiscal responsibility, and analyse political constraints to efficient allocation of resources for health and education services. She is also the lead author of the policy research report, Making Politics Work for Development, Harnessing Transparency and Citizen Engagement. Her research and advisory work spans a diverse range of countries including Benin, China, India, the Philippines, Nigeria, Tanzania and Uganda. Stuti, I'm very much interested in this whole work on policy and what you and the World Bank does to help with trying to bring our attention to what's going on in the world around us, both developed and more so developing countries. But how important would it be to, and why do you do the work, I should say, at a very basic level in terms of the question, why do you do the work and why is policy important?
I sit in the research division of the bank, which is like an academic department within the World Bank. And it was, in fact, by far my dream job when I was coming out of graduate school with my PhD from MIT. And it was because it allows you to work in research, but with your first objective being to apply the research and knowledge that you acquire to addressing pressing policy problems, to sound idealistic, to help change the world to a better place, rather than journal publications being the first of first order importance. Journal publications and research is, of course, essential to hone your skills, to think rigorously about questions. But I think those of us who select into the research division at the bank are really inspired to bring that learning to make a difference in the policy world for changing real development outcomes.
And what character is required to do such a thing, Stuti, in terms of being academic to write these journal articles and then to have the extra, I don't mean to say initiative, but what kind of character is required to do such a thing?
I think the world of economics is also changing. So now in terms of entrepreneurship and initiative, academia has a lot of it with the new randomista revolution and all of these research centers at places like MIT and Yale, the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab and the Innovations for Poverty Action. So in that sense, I don't think the distinguishing feature is so much entrepreneurship or initiative. So because a lot of economists working in development, they are indeed motivated with being on the ground, doing field work, making an impact. I think what is different about someone like me, and again, I would not classify all of my colleagues in the research division or describe them the same way, is more interest in the big picture questions. And again, it's a difference of first or second order motivation, with the first order motivation really being about, can I answer the pressing questions that are facing the policy world, rather than being motivated by, can I make a difference methodologically or write that AER paper? Of course, that would be wonderful too. But again, the first order question is, can I answer a really big question which may have a transformative impact on the world?
Using that word transformative, did you come across some instance in your life before you decided to go into the World Bank, or when you decided you want to make change to the world? Was there an example that transformed your thinking in terms of being able to do work outside of academic methodology and apply it to the real world and trying to make a change for the better?
It's interesting that you asked that, because I think my transformational experience was more intellectual than sort of driven by some kind of cliched experience with poverty. It wasn't that at all. I grew up in India, so seeing poverty was sort of a way of life. That's how a complex world is. So I wouldn't say that was transformational. That was just what you saw every day. What was transformational for me was the introduction to economics. So I remember in the first class I took in high school in India, we had the subject of economics defined in our textbook, and the definition that was provided was by Lionel Robbins, and it was something along the lines of, economics is the science of human behavior in making difficult choices to address unlimited means with scarce resources. And I don't think I'm getting it accurately, but the key words for me were making difficult choices, unlimited needs, scarce resources. And I was blown away by that, because it seemed to me this is a subject that wants to be the science of everything as it pertains to human society. And so I just got hooked from that day on, and, bit by bit through my sort of student years, that is what sort of drew me into the policy world. So I think my driving motivation is, here is this fantastic discipline which is day by day building these incredibly rigorous tools of thinking about the world around us, of the human world around us, to distinguish from the physics world. And how can we use these tools to make the human world a better place?
That's absolutely amazing, and how such a quote like that, one sentence, can encapsulate a whole thinking in terms of economics and what economics is about, and how that made a change in your perception and what you want to do.
Yes.
What I would love to explore with you, Stuti, is the whole idea initially about the importance of, say, freedom. And what I mean by freedom in terms of the basic human right for, as you mentioned, the accessing some scarce resources, perhaps, or even the freedom to, I suppose, I don't want to borrow a theme from Milton Friedman's book, but the freedom to choose or to make decisions. And when I say the freedom to choose, we might apply it to government, the electing of government. How important is that for for you and your work at the World Bank?
So, here your question is getting at the heart of my research, which sort of culminated in this report that you mentioned on making politics work for development. So I think I could answer it by talking a little bit about this book and how it came about. So it's a product of the Development Research Group. Our director, Asla Demirgurkant, asked me to prepare it. And it came out of, in general, each time we write a single paper, as you know, we are trying to define a very narrow question and then answer it as rigorously as we can. So in a sense, our aim is, can we create a very sharp piece of a bigger jigsaw puzzle? And policy research reports of the World Bank are an effort to step back from creating those individual pieces and saying, now let's put that puzzle together. And let's put it together without knowing what the picture looks like. So let's use the putting together of it to build a big picture. And so this report was, what can we learn from accumulating economics research on the functioning of political markets and what its consequences are for how governments choose economic policies, what types of institutions do they establish that are capable of providing the public goods that we need for development, that are capable of addressing market failures, supporting competitive markets, and tackling problems of persistent inequality and poverty. So one force was we have giants like Daron Acemoglu, Jim Robinson, Roger Myerson, Tim Besley, who've been doing incredible work for a long time, taking economic tools to the analysis of politics. Then on the other hand, we had all of these events around the world, if you like, expressions of freedom of citizens everywhere, taking to the streets, making demands on their governments, accessing dynamic media markets. So how do we sort of make sense of what are the implications of these forces by applying what we are learning from the cutting edge of economics research? And finally, there was this realization among sort of veteran development practitioners and seasoned policy advisors, such as Shanta Devarajan, who you had on your show, and such as Asla, who's the director of our research department, that politics really has for our business of international development assistance. So Shanta was describing how it's at least twice every single day that he encounters the problem of politics in his work of working with governments to implement good development policies. So these three things kind of led to writing this report, and I reached out to three people from among the young economists who are working, I think, at the frontiers of these themes and who are devoting themselves to these questions rather than just dabbling with political economy as one of many things that they do. So my co-authors on the report were Ernesto Dalbo and Federico Feinand from the economics department at Berkeley, and Claudio Ferraz from PUC Rio in Brazil. And so the three of them just have done some of the most exciting work on these themes. And so that's how the report came about. And I think the report is really sort of distilling the recent advances in the literature to understand the functioning of political markets, to examine why and how politics is fundamental to economic development, and how can we harness these growing forces around the world of citizens exercising, taking the freedom to voice their opinions, to make their demands, and to access information. These forces could be harnessed for the good, and left to their own devices, they could also go down dark paths. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think all of these themes are in fact about how do we harness freedoms to build better public sector institutions to address the massive public good problems of our times.
A lot of governments there's almost like a duality or a spectrum of government in terms of, say, democratic and autocratic, and then everything in between, really. So how difficult is it for policymakers like yourselves at the World Bank to try and put forward your suggestions on what makes good policy and a recommendation that this should be adopted for the benefit of citizens? And I'm sure, do you have some good government that would take this on board, and we hopefully expect them to implement these policies to the best of their abilities for their citizens? But it's not always going to be the case. And, how can you do that? And secondly, I suppose, how difficult would it be to realize that they're not going to do something, and how relieved would it be when they do something about it?
So I think this is the beauty of the institution of the World Bank, is that our articles of agreement and our mission statement is very clear that what we claim to do is to promote economic development everywhere, regardless of political institutions. So we are determinedly apolitical in that sense. But what the research is saying is that to think about the functioning of political markets as influencing incentives and behavior in the public sector, and how this has profound consequences for economic outcomes, actually makes understanding political markets as an institutional feature, makes it entirely consistent with our articles of agreement and with our mandate. And in fact, if we are to be true to our mandate and true to our mission goals of eradicating poverty, promoting shared prosperity and economic well-being around the world, we have to confront the latest research on the issue of how political markets shape those outcomes. And I think being non-partisan and and applying these lessons across countries, regardless of their overarching political and formal political institutions, is what gives an organization like the World Bank the comparative advantage to then leverage things like transparency, bring knowledge to bear upon improving those political markets. So again, your question is getting at the heart of the report. Show how it is that the key question is not democracy versus autocracy, but rather how leaders everywhere at different levels of government, not just at the national level, but across a myriad working level agencies of government, whether those leaders who wield power in government are selected and sanctioned on the basis of performance in delivering broad public goods, as opposed to on the basis of providing targeted private benefits. And so this lens of looking at it as leader selection and sanctioning, which happens in every institutional context across the political spectrum, really sort of makes these issues amenable to us in every institutional context that we work in.
And do you have an example in which a government was holding back in terms of their public policy or the public policy choice for their citizens and not providing them with, say, necessary means, and then maybe citizens trying to stand up for what they feel they're entitled to and trying to take this public choice good, if you want to call it, and deliver it to the local people?
So I think the report and the research that it covers is replete with such examples. But let me give you one that is in the very beginning of the report as one of our motivating examples. And it comes from a conversation with the Treasury Secretary of a country on the African continent, who was describing on the eve of his minister going to present the budget to Parliament, a specific problem in the education sector, where bulk of the budget was being allocated to spending on the salaries of public school teachers. And the secretary was very eloquently describing how he's fully aware of research evidence that there's great high levels of absenteeism among public school teachers in his country, and that the public school teachers deliver less even when they are present in school than their private school counterparts in terms of learning among children. but that nevertheless, he's politically constrained to allocate public budget to the salaries of these absent teachers who are not motivated to teach. And he actually asked me very pointedly, what can you tell me from research that will give me a new insight into this political problem? And how can research help me understand what are things I can do, circumscribed as I am by political constraints, to nevertheless bring about incremental change? And we talk, is it transparency? So transparency is a buzzword, and it was being used wholesale to say whenever there's a problem of politics or governance, just bring transparency in. So the report was really motivated by conversations like that, by reform leaders in countries who are struggling and they know the nitty-gritty of the political problem in their context better than any of us. But they were looking for how can research help them? Research that looks at the market interactions from a distance rather than sort of the nitty-gritty being in the middle of the politics. And how far can we go with something like transparency, which is relatively more tractable to them than confronting the political constraints of difficult reforms?
Why do you think citizen engagement and transparency then holds the key to solving, say, government failures, even though that example of government, there was failure there, but he wanted to make some incremental changes to policy? But if there's evidence of governments failing because the old policies are still in place, or the actors who are part of that particular market do not tend to respond to new policies or end up not wanting to, I suppose, cooperate with government, what can the citizen do, or how important, do they hold the key for this engagement and transparency?
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent question, Frank. And I think we confronted this very early on in the report by making a real distinction between what we call apolitical citizen engagement and political engagement. So in fact, we described it in a very similar way to how you did just now, where, if the problem is in the incentives and behavior of powerful political actors and vested interests, what can citizens do, even with transparency? Quote unquote, ordinary citizens who bear no office, who have no powers within the government. And we described how the one type of power that citizens are increasingly acquiring around the world is the power to select and sanction leaders. So we provide data on how electoral institutions are spreading across countries, even if individual countries might have sort of stagnated or moved in a different direction than competitive elections. Overall, the distribution of countries around the world in every region has shifted towards a greater role for ordinary citizens in selecting and sanctioning their leaders, typically through electoral processes. And it's not just at the national level, even within countries where national political institutions are not so electoral in the common sense. Even these countries have local electoral and political competition at the local government level. And so in a world where either formal institutions are changing or even informally, citizens are taking to the streets or using mass media to coordinate massive collective action, they are either being given by the system or are acquiring by force these powers of selecting and sanctioning leaders. And that is how we analyzed it in the report. And that is how we pulled out this single thread from quite a complex web of political economy research, that it's the selection and sanctioning of leaders that is finding both government failure and how to solve it. And given that we are in this global context of increasing citizen engagement and increasing transparency, how can we use these global forces to improve the selection and sanctioning of leaders so that it happens more on the basis of performance and delivering broad public goods?
What you describe, and I never came across this term before, but you describe how new information and communication technologies has put, in a way, some power back into the hands of citizens of a particular country, and you describe that as a dictator's dilemma.
Sadly, it's not my invention. I borrowed it directly from the World Development Report 2016 on the internet and digital technology. And I believe they have a text box on the dictator's dilemma. And I believe they have used it from other authors in their turn. So it's worth looking at that box in the WDR 2016. And then, of course, we say what it is in the report as well. And it is really this dilemma that the dynamic media markets, new technologies of information and communication are making it. We live in a world where power has become more dispersed and leaders have to deal with that. And it's in their enlightened self-interest to try to harness these forces for the public good. And that can be done in very diverse institutional ways. And so we provide one very abstract lens of looking at how any particular institution is likely to function well or not. And that abstract lens is whether leaders will be selected and sanctioned on the right basis, whether contestation for leadership will happen on the right platforms of public goods.
And the concept of the dictator's dilemma, correct me if I'm wrong, but when there was evidence of the Arab Springs and other kind of conflict that might be going on internally, civil wars and that type of thing, before all of these events actually occurred, we possibly knew that there were dictators in some countries. But when the Arab Springs broke out, and then we see some videos and stories from Aleppo, it's quite obviously heartbreaking, but the media has allowed us to get in touch and get some small sense of what people are suffering and why they want, in other cases, why they want an end to dictator rule.
Well, let me try to push back on this a little, because I think we could think of the opposite examples where more authoritarian developmental leaders who actually make the state perform much better in servicing their citizens than many messy democracies.
Yes.
And let me also point out a real problem with messy democracies, which is that it's not really nefarious leaders, but it's prejudices, biases, myopia, and the lack of capacity to understand technical evidence among citizens at large, which can prevent well-intentioned leaders from doing what is supported by the evidence. Governments in every institutional context can fail to deliver the public goods that are needed, again, for competitive markets, for tackling persistent inequality and poverty. When leaders are able to gain office and gain power in government by polarizing citizens and exploiting these ideological divisions among them, rather than seeking common ground. And I think this type of problem not only applies across institutional contexts, not only can it turn our priors about democracy versus dictatorship on its head, but in fact it applies across rich and poor countries. So I think some of the lessons from this sort of applying economic tools to understand political markets applies equally to rich countries as to poor countries. And, in a sense, I wonder if we can be truly revolutionary with this report and say that the business of development is not necessarily one of taking lessons from the rich world and building capacity in the poor world, that when it comes to governance, it may in fact be the other way around, that the hunger of citizens in the poor world to do something about the problem of politics, the urgency of the problem, the lack of delusion that things are not all going great, that we need to do better, may be allowing poor countries to experiment more with institutions of public accountability. While citizens in the rich world may be more complacent, sort of more smug in their superiority. And so I wonder whether these governance questions and the role of transparency and citizen engagement, whether there's a lot we can learn from the evolving experience of poor countries and apply it elsewhere.
I love the way you did that, actually, and it really makes sense. And I totally agree, because even poor countries, obviously those countries will in time hopefully meet higher standards in the future, but they have a raw sense of what needs to be done in order to change their economy or their country for the better, possibly at local or national level. But with the democratic or democracies that are more developed, as you said, there's probably a lot of things going wrong there, and possibly just as much corruption as well. What I was going to lead on with that, with the previous question I asked you, for all of us who sees and are able to read what's going on in other countries when certain events come about that is a catalyst for change, how difficult is it for you at a policy level to see a lot of us that are watching from the outside? It becomes normalized and less sensationalized over time. It's difficult to say that, but not many people seem to be doing anything about it except for obviously military and opposition, but we want people more so to be more compassionate and to stop this. And my example, I suppose, I think of Syria.
Well, I think the example you're thinking of is a particularly difficult problem. And I don't know, I think this is something that we are all grappling with at different levels and a bit at a loss. I don't think anybody has strong, powerful answers for what to do here. The best, I think my very humble answer here would be what the research we are doing can hope to do is to prevent this kind of escalation in the future. So there are fragile contexts which have not yet descended into the chaos that is Syria, where we may draw lessons for how to build sustainable institutions from the ground up, from the first mile up, down at the local village level and step by step further up to the national level. And institutions that have legitimacy, that inspire trust that they are serving the greater public good. And I think there's a lot of possibility of taking these lessons to these fragile contexts. But I must say, how you tackle situations which have already descended into chaos is something that, in all humility, I don't think I have a good answer for that.
Is there an example of an autocratic government, or perhaps if I could use the word a dictatorship, because obviously that's not the same as autocratic, I don't think anyway, but is there one that works perfectly well where the leader is more open to have the freedoms of its citizens? I know there's some countries out there that have long leaders that stay on for such a long time, and we saw that with, say, Cuba and some Asian countries. But is there one that actually works better than democracy?
Oh, I think there are plenty of examples. So there's formal research on it. Tim Besley has a paper on, what makes successful autocracies. So you can imagine the spectacular experience of China and Ethiopia in poverty reduction, with institutions that in the Western sense of the word democracy would not be described thus. But they nevertheless do really well, and the lens of selection and sanctioning of leaders is what explains it. So there are successful autocratic institutions that have somehow solved the problem of selecting and sanctioning leaders on the basis of good performance. And the report discusses detailed research on this by Tim Besley and others. At the same time, it's difficult to take a lesson from a well-functioning autocracy to another place and say, well, it worked, in China or in Ethiopia, and so now we can take it to Kenya or India. And we argue that, that lesson cannot be drawn from it. So Kenya and India have their own messy democracies, and the way towards improved outcomes in Kenya and India are to improve the functioning of those democratic institutions.
And my guess is that culture plays a significant role there too in each country.
So we define culture quite precisely as beliefs about how others are behaving. So in that sense, this notion of culture may not be that hard to change. It's not a value system that's embedded in our neural network. So we view it as a coordination problem. And therefore, with transparency being able to play a pivotal and transformational role by shifting what people think others are doing towards the public sector.
Is it okay if I ask you a little bit more on the report, Making Politics Work for Development? It's quite a large report, and you touched on at the beginning of this interview, you mentioned what some of the things I referred to were at the beginning of the report. Is there anything that comes later on in the report that is particularly extremely insightful, which I'm sure everything in the report is, and that we haven't yet touched on?
So I think we've actually touched on several pieces of it. One, to take this market view of politics, bring the tools of economic markets into politics, and how that gave us this key insight that what unites this very dispersed and complex literature is this processes of leader selection and sanctioning, and how you can use this abstract lens to examine problems in many different contexts. Then we touched upon how the problem of politics is generalizable across institutional settings. Again, taking the lens of whether the leaders who wield power in government have the right incentives to pursue economic policies on the basis of the best available technical evidence. But then we went beyond that as well and said that it's not just a problem of nefarious leaders, but you can go deeper and see how the problem may emanate from society as a whole, conflict of interest and ideological polarization among citizens. And then we talked about, these global forces of change, of transparency and citizens taking to the streets or to the ballot box, and how left to themselves, these forces could go in many different directions. And it's not, there are many reasons to worry about sort of bad outcomes of unhealthy political engagement by citizens or repressive responses by leaders. And yet we describe how taking the long historical view, relying on some accounts of transition from weak to good institutions in the history of the United States and in the history of the United Kingdom, how the confluence of these two forces seemed to have provided tipping points for change and created strong public sector institutions that were able to become professionalized bureaucracies insulated from political interference of the wrong kind. And so we sort of take that long historical view as well. So how can we use the confluence of these forces to try to harness and nudge them in the right directions? And I suppose what we only briefly alluded to is we make the case that there's a particular role for international organizations and external assistance. And that is the role of our comparative advantage in sort of big data. So we have the technical tools, the human resources, and the financial resources to put together large amounts of data. And not only just put together the data, but actually draw meaningful information content from that data through economic and econometric analysis. And producing meaningful information content on the performance of policies and the public sector in delivering public goods is something we are already doing. But we do it largely with the goal of reaching policymakers at the highest levels and trying to persuade them. And the insight in this report is if we could only complement what we are already doing with a truly serious approach to communicating that information content to citizens as well, that holds potential for transformative change. So in that same information communicated in ways that take the role of communication and shifting entrenched and prior beliefs seriously, requires rigorous scientific investment in understanding how to communicate certain ideas, And it requires investment in understanding which level of government jurisdiction to communicate it at. And that again brings into play the lens of leader selection and sanctioning. So targeting information to citizens where they are actively engaged in selecting and sanctioning leaders, such as the local government level within countries across the political spectrum. That insight, I don't think, has come together in this way in anything else that has been written on transparency. Most of the work on transparency has talked about the generalized importance of transparency. And we derive much more strategic implications for what information content, how to communicate it, at which jurisdiction level. And we draw those insights from this understanding of political markets to shift the bases on which leaders are selected and sanctioned.
How difficult, I know you mentioned there big data, but how difficult is it for academics like yourself at the World Bank to rely on this data? I had a previous guest on the podcast, Morton Jervin, and he wrote a book on poor numbers in Africa and how difficult it is to rely on these particular statistics or these data to put into the research. And do you find that, or do you have, I know you mentioned at the beginning you do a lot of field ground research, and Shanta actually said that he spent time with a family and got a sense of how people live in that particular area.
So I think this is a real problem, the lack of high quality statistics in the poor regions of the world. And I know that our poverty department, poverty global practice at the bank, this is at the forefront of their agenda. And I think that the case the report is making is for external investments in generating good statistics, not both financial investments as well as staking our credibility and reputation on the quality of that data. So not just capacity building of national statistical organizations, but really leveraging external capacity much more in generating data through hiring third-party data gatherers like survey firms. I think it's one of those areas where there's a lot that we can do with our colleagues in the poverty practice of the bank, and those conversations are underway. But to convince a poor country to spend more of their budget resources on statistics is going to be naturally a very hard sell. And I'm not convinced myself that that's a sell we want to make. In fact, if good data is a global public good, then it's precisely the richer world and external development assistance that should be funding the global public good of good data everywhere, not just through funding and financing, but also through staking our professional credibility and reputation on whether data is of high quality, credible, and insulated from political interference.
Stuti, can I ask you a couple of quick fire questions that I'm asking my guests lately?
Sure.
I'd love to know if you have any writing tips that you actually use, or even research tips more so, that you actually tend to follow quite systematically to help you get your reports done, your blog as well at the World Bank, how you work around that particular area. And I'd love to even dip into the research side of things.
Well, I feel as though I have learned so much myself through the process of writing this report and through writing more blogs to communicate the ideas of the report. And one of the things I learned is write short sentences. I think my natural instinct is to write long, convoluted sentences with lots of clauses and connections. And now I discipline myself to edit and rewrite to make every sentence as short as possible. That's one. And the second is to write the intuition. So not to use mystifying language, not to use jargon, but to, maybe as trained economists, maybe we think in jargonistic terms and we think in sort of algebra. But then once we've thought that through, to try to translate it into a verbal argument that any intelligent person should be able to understand. So I tried to sort of think through how I would say it to my brother who works at Google and knows nothing about economics, and then write it. So that's the second tip.
Stuti, also, I'd love to know if you could step into the DeLorean and time travel. What era would you go back to? God. And who would you like to speak, and what conversation would you think you'd have?
So at one point, I think I would be fascinated with this question, and I would think about traveling maybe to the Mayan era in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, or to the Enlightenment era in the Arab civilization, or to the Aryan period in North India. But I think more and more I'm fascinated by the world around me and with people currently living in the world. So in terms of sort of conversations with people, if I had to go back to time travel, I find myself gravitating towards writers and poets. So, I think of Jane Austen, whose work I just adore. I reread Jane Austen. I must have read every single one of her novel more than a couple of times. And I think it's such a pity that she has come to be seen as a writer of romantic stories for girly types, because what I love about her work is her keen observation of society, which I found so pertinent to the society I grew up in India, although she was writing for a completely different place and time. So I imagine things like, if I were able to sit down with Jane Austen, sort of woman to woman, how would she react to seeing a modern career woman? Would she have the mental capacity to understand what women today have achieved? Would she be able to transcend her time and experience? I think about talking with Rabindranath Tagore. He seemed to be a man beyond his times. How would he react if he were able to sit down with someone like me and see how we live in a world where we have access to so much more ways of thinking and being, meeting people of different cultures? I think about the Chinese poets who I read in translation in a work by Vikram Seth. And, at a time when these were poets who were trained to be government bureaucrats, but at that time in the Tang dynasty, they were required to take an exam to write poetry, to become public servants. And then they would be posted to these far-flung provinces where they would lead these lonely lives away from their families, and they would take to writing poetry. So I feel fascinated about what would it be like to sit down with one of them and talk to them. So, I don't think about politicians and leaders when I think about, or scientists when I go back in time. I think about all of these literary figures.
Having people like Jane Austen and your type of thinking, and obviously you love the arts as well from what I've heard from you, but your critical thinking as well, how they can collaborate and perhaps make life a better place. And maybe the Tang dynasty had a pretty much spot on when they asked their public servants to write poetry. I don't know.
Yeah, I think you raise a very important point, Frank. I remember when I first learned about the poetry requirement for government bureaucrats in China, I thought what a fascinating thing and what types of benefits it might have. I haven't thought more about it in terms of some more concrete ways in which we might have this fertile interaction between scientists and the fine arts creative types. I suppose one this issue makes me lament a little bit our own profession. So I think I've sort of waxed lyrical about how blown away I was with the rigorous tools of economic analysis. Balancing that, I remember feeling quite disappointed with the social life of economists because I felt as though most people who self-select into being economists tend to have rather tunnel-like vision. And, they're so focused on math and methodology, and a lot sort of don't have this sensibility of discussing poetry or literature or music. And I wonder whether our profession gets limited by that. But I don't have a good answer on is there a way to improve things? Because if it's self-selection of certain types, there's not much that can, and maybe it's a process of specialization and not much can be done about it. But I do think that there are individuals who, by their individual idiosyncrasies, sort of gravitate towards big questions and grandiose ideas, if you will, who also tend to be the more artistic types.
But I'd love to find out, do you have any recommended books that you'd like to share with us?
So I think I've already mentioned some of the authors I love.
Yes, you have.
Who I haven't talked about is George Eliot. I love Middlemarch. That's another book I read and reread. So if anyone has not read Middlemarch, I would say start now. I love Vikram Seth, everything that he writes, and just so eclectic, and he opens your mind to so many different things, such as his hiking journey through China and then all the way to his epic stories of India. I like old-fashioned storytellers. I love J.K. Rowling. I'm one of those grown-ups who would go to the bookstore. I picked a bookstore that children don't go to, and I would go there at midnight and buy her book as they came out. And then for the next day, I would do nothing, not eat, not sleep, do nothing but read until I finished it. And then I recently read her novel for grown-ups, A Casual Vacancy. And I've thought that it was the best book since Dickens about what poverty looks like in the rich world. And it gave me some insights into, what are ways of tackling the injustice of children who happen to be born in families that cannot care for them, and what that suggests about what public policy should be doing to give every child a fair chance. So yeah, I suppose I like old-fashioned storytellers, and once in a while you come across one of these from which you in fact take away insights for your professional work.
Stuti, thank you so much for being so inspiring and for joining me on Economic Rockstar. I had a blast and I personally learned a lot from you.
Thank you so much, Frank.
Share with our listeners where they could find you.
Oh gosh, I guess they could just Google me, and the first thing that would come up would probably be my staff page at the World Bank, and then the link to the report, Making Politics Work for Development. And I would invite everybody to read that report. We put a lot of work into it, and we are really excited about where we can go with it.
And I'll put the link to the report on the show notes page at economicrockstar.com/Stuti Khemani. Stuti, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. You are an economic rockstar.
Thank you so much, Frank. I really appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this podcast, why not leave some feedback or comments on the show notes page on economicrockstar.com, where you can also sign up and be a member of the Economic Rockstar community. If you're listening to this episode on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, I would love to have some feedback and for you to leave an honest rating and review, as this will help with the rankings of the show so that more people can find it. If you're listening on the website economicrockstar.com, make sure you check out the back catalogue of all previous episodes and interviews with some amazing professors and authors at economicrockstar.com/podcasts. Thanks for listening, and I really appreciate your loyal support. I know how much you love audio, so why not get a free audiobook with Economic Rockstar today? I've teamed up with audiobooks.com to bring you this amazing offer. Visit audiobooks.com/rockstar to download your free audiobook now.